The Earth. In just a few millennia, we have learnt how to live on it, and then to tame it, before finally dominating it. Since then, we have become so powerful that our activities have profoundly transformed it.
What we have done to the planet is absolutely incredible on such an immeasurable timescale.
But are we responsible enough to manage this power? Today, this domination has resulted in dramatic consequences. We are altering the whole Earth system and thereby triggering major climate change. Tens of thousands of species are threatened by extinction. Eventually, man may end up on that list. Yet we turn a deaf ear to every alert, as though climate change were only a mirage.
One big question is why human societies aren't acting more rapidly to counter some of the negative changes we're making in the Earth, like rapid climate change.
In the past, other societies also faced the upheavals of climate change. Some were able to find solutions, whilst others died out. We can learn a great deal from their stories. Because today, the challenge that we need to take on is the same, that of adapting. How far can climate change push us to question our model, the model that has made us so powerful?
Whatever solution we use will require political courage, because it will require change.
For several years now, across the world, initiatives have been springing up. States, multinationals or citizens, the various components of our society are looking for solutions and initiating change. By looking at past civilizations and analyzing the present, we will see the path that could lead us to a less troubled future, a future in which we could live on a preserved planet. For the past 200 years, in order to sustain our development, we have been drawing on the Earth's reserves as we please, as if its resources were inexhaustible. At present, every year, our consumption equates to a planet and a half, as if nature was one giant bank, offering us credit. Because our desire to succeed knows no bounds, to eradicate hunger, to live forever, to travel vast distances in record time. We have always wanted to go beyond our natural limits, and over time, we have succeeded thanks to the natural resources we have extracted. In the United States, Phoenix, the capital of Arizona, is a perfect example of this development on credit. It's a modern city like so many others. The only difference? It's situated in the middle of a desert. In 1950, it had a population of barely 100,000, and then air conditioning arrived. With the electricity supplied by coal plants, life under a blazing sun became possible. In 60 years, the population has multiplied by 13. Today, Phoenix is the 6th largest city in the United States, with over 1.5 million inhabitants. Like many others, Thomas Basso settled here over 20 years ago. Despite the arid climate, he is able to devote himself to his preferred hobby all year round, golf. 184 golf courses have sprung up in the middle of this desert, as if it was completely natural.
I lived in St. Louis at the time, And every winter I'd put the clubs away and couldn't play golf. And I had a lot of clients in the Phoenix metropolitan area as a money manager. So I thought, why not live where my clients live and enjoy the desert lifestyle? The good thing to live in Phoenix is that you can get up in the morning, like on a day like today. Here we are in April, and it's 68 degrees, 69 degrees Fahrenheit. You can come out and enjoy a beautiful round of golf in a beautiful breeze, and you get your vitamin D from the sun. And so it's a very healthy, active lifestyle. I can't see living anywhere else, and I've been to a lot of places in the world.
However, behind the idyllic golf courses and their year-round immaculate expanses of green lies another reality. In Arizona, each inhabitant consumes an average of 600 liters of water per day. It's one of the highest consumption levels in the United States. It is the price to pay for living in the desert, especially when agriculture is booming. Thanks to mild temperatures and abundant sunshine, crops are numerous and plentiful. The only catch? They require water, and sometimes a lot of water. Cotton is one of the most common crops in Arizona, but it is also one of the thirstiest plants. And water tends to be scarce in the middle of the desert. So, to support the development of agriculture in cities, it had to be sourced from elsewhere. The largest and most expensive irrigation system in the country was built 20 years ago. 541 kilometers of canals draw directly from the Colorado River. But these reserves aren't inexhaustible. These days, the Colorado River and the surrounding water tables empty rapidly and struggle to renew themselves. Phoenix currently suffers from extreme drought, the most intense in 1,000 years. This water shortage could have a direct impact on city dwellers, at the latest in 10 years, with severe consequences on the easygoing way of life which so many have come to love. But there's no big panic. 10 years is a long way away. We'll be able to react in good time, and our successes thus far are the proof.
You have to let almost the problem be there, and then mankind is very, very innovative. It's very entrepreneurial. It will solve the problem. Here we are in Arizona. We're one state away, California's in the way, of the ocean. The ocean has more water than all of mankind could ever use. It's got salt in it. So at some price, you can desalinate that water and you have fresh water. If we are willing in Arizona, personally, to pay for getting that water here and paying for the price of desalinating it, then we can live here. If not, we need to choose to live someplace else.
The solution seems simple. Desalinating the water from the sea or moving a whole city like Phoenix. There's a new feat for us to accomplish. The challenge is tempting, but the reality is different. What if our way of life, so greedy in energy usage, was just simply not adapted to living in an environment like the desert? Phoenix is a symbol of our development model. Thanks to the power of fossil energies, coal, oil or gas, we are convinced that we can find a solution to everything, every time, without ever worrying about the natural resources required. Why do we always see our successes whilst all too often remaining blind to their serious consequences?
The reason we use fossil fuels is not because we're stupid. The reason we use fossil fuels is not because we just want to destroy the environment and we have no idea about this. The reason we use fossil fuels is because this energy has changed our livelihoods in ways that we don't want to give up. We love to travel. We love the idea that we can do things without so much labor. Fossil fuel is what's made this possible. The question is really, to me, is not how we're going to give these things up, but rather how we're going to change our societies and our energy systems to make it possible for us to live on Earth without changing the climate. I think it's definitely possible, but the reasons that it's so hard to change is because actually we're quite fond of the way we change the Earth.
When change becomes necessary, it is not easy to face up to the fears of losing one's comforts in life. We are not the first in history to find ourselves in such a deadlock. The story of Phoenix bears a remarkable similarity to an episode of the Viking conquests. When the Vikings landed in Greenland over 1,000 years ago, the climate was quite mild. The settlers wanted to believe in the promises of a green, fertile country. They applied the same society model which had allowed them to dominate northern Europe to the southernmost pastures of the icy island. Soon, trading activities between Europe and Greenland were thriving. For 200 years, these new colonies experienced a wonderful growth phase. But Greenland was nonetheless a challenging land. To adapt, the Vikings turned their focus to sheep, which were more resistant to seasonal changes. But between the 13th and the 14th centuries, the climate underwent a radical change. Boats were iced in, supplies became rarer and rarer. Little by little, the farmers tried to become hunters, but to no avail. Farming, trade, religion, unsuited to this harsh environment, the very foundations of Viking society fell one after another. As soon as they could, many were those who boarded to flee. Those who stayed tried to adopt the way of life of the Inuits, which was perfectly suited to this kingdom of ice. But it was impossible for the Vikings to transform their culture to this point. Their beliefs, their way of life, their activities were all too far removed from those of the Inuits. The Vikings therefore vanished completely from Greenland by the end of the 15th century. As for the Inuits, they still inhabit the White Island today. Will the people of Phoenix be forced to one day abandon the desert like the Vikings were forced to leave Greenland? And on a global level, where will we go if our model is not adapted to the available resources on this Earth? Right now, no one is seriously asking this question. Quite the opposite. Greater and greater ecological anomalies follow one after the other. This environmental craziness is the culmination of a long battle. Man has continuously sought to free himself from nature's constraints. Today, our activities have made us the most powerful force on the planet. We are profoundly altering it. For the first time in over 12,000 years, we could even have changed geological eras. The name of this new era is the Anthropocene, literally the age of man, the last act of a fight that intensified dramatically 200 years ago.
At the beginning of the 19th century, the idea emerged that man was fighting against nature, that his freedom would be the result of winning this battle. Another new idea was that to solve political and social issues, such as poverty, we needed more. We needed to grow the economy. We believed that growth and consequently controlling nature would solve social issues, would finally bring the revolutionary age to a close.
To leave poverty behind and achieve his freedom, man therefore needed to make use of nature. With coal, it was like nature had offered us a gift. Buried under the ground for millennia, it became the first fuel of this revolution, the engine that powered an extraordinary industrial frenzy. All across Europe, factories sprouted up. In England, Manchester had become the world capital of cotton. By the middle of the 19th century, the city, surrounded by 500 factories, was plunged into the polluting smog of these blast furnaces. It was the price to pay for modernity. However, from the outset, some people did not want to pay that price.
In France, in England, around Paris and Manchester, hundreds of petitions from residents began circulating. Complaints about filthy factories which pointed out how they were denaturing the environment, spawning epidemics and sometimes even the decline of the population. It is interesting to note how dissension was curbed. In France, this occurred through a new medical doctrine called hygienism, which professed that the most determining factor in the health of populations was not their environment, but their wealth, their prosperity. The argument went on to say that economic growth and industrialization resulted in a more prosperous population, and therefore to healthier people. This social theory of health gave an incredibly powerful argument to the French administration, which was authorizing the establishment of factories en masse.
If wealth meant health and factories meant wealth, then protecting factories became indispensable. In 1810, France instituted a founding text, a decree defining the environmental criteria to be respected before a factory could be opened. Once the authorization had been granted, its activity was protected, forever relinquishing any risk of closure. In cases of pollution or nuisance, the resident's only legal recourse was to claim hypothetical financial compensation.
The 1810 decree, which could be called the right to pollute, had an international influence for a fairly simple reason. The Napoleonic Empire was at its height, with a considerable influence on the laws of its conquered countries.
From the start of the Industrial Revolution, environmental issues were known. Destroying the surrounding nature became a necessary cost, listed alongside other expenditure on balance sheets. Textiles, chemicals, the steel industry. In less than 100 years, new industries flourished, especially in France and England. The use of coal became global. Everywhere, it amplified the power of machines. In the United States, Taylorism optimized the new providential energy, opening the doors to mass production, and with it, mass consumption.
Another historical pillar of the Anthropocene was the development of a consumer society. It began to appear towards the end of the 19th century in the US, along with the concept of brands. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th is also when consumer credit first appeared in the US. Consumer credit plays a pivotal role in the Anthropocene, since it is what allowed the automobile industry to flourish. By the 1920s, half of all American households had an automobile, much earlier than in Europe. 2/3 of these cars were bought thanks to consumer credit.
A new era was dawning, symbolized by the American way of life, a dream for so many.
Designed for the whole family.
This era was the fruit of many energy choices born from the industrial interests and the needs of consumers. Let's take the case of tramways. In the 1930s, they had all but disappeared from big American cities, despite being by far the most widespread and least polluting means of public transport. But over the years, individual cars had taken over the streets, under the pressure of the big car manufacturing giants. Gradually, these giants bought out the weakened tramway companies, before finally getting rid of them and replacing them with buses. In 1933, President Roosevelt imposed a centralized electrical system in the United States. This system required the installation of coal plants to supply the network, even though at the same time 6 million wind turbines covered the Midwest. At first, they had facilitated the pumping of water in agriculture, and now these turbines were beginning to produce electricity. However, the impact of pollution on climate had already been documented. From the second half of the 19th century, scientists warned that our activities risked profoundly changing the Earth's climate. In 1895, the Swedish chemist Arrhenius, a future Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, even supported this theory with his calculations.
At the end of the 19th century, Arrhenius was the first to calculate the effects of doubling the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere on the climate in terms of temperatures.
The emergence of an environmental conscience, therefore, dates back much earlier than one might believe. So why is it that these alerts, like those in today's world, don't lead to any major changes in our development mode? Maybe because by disassociating ourselves from nature, we have created the most powerful of all human societies. But power can be the cruelest illusion, the Achilles heel of a society. Before us, the Maya had a bitter experience of this. It was the year 400 in Central America. For some time, the climate had been very favorable to Mayan land. As we are today, the Maya were at that time the most powerful civilization on their continent. They had mastered writing and devised their own calendar. Each city-state had its own king, and it was believed that a king's prayers called forth the rain. From generation to generation, the population grew. The Maya society became increasingly complex, structured around ever more distinct social classes. But there was no unity. Each city coveted its neighbor's resources, triggering multiple conflicts. At its height, the Maya society numbered 70 city-states in permanent conflict. Then came the day when the gods no longer heard the king's appeals. Gradually, the climate changed. Rains were rarer, crops less productive. Food became scarce for a population which had grown and grown. A drought hit, worse than any that had been seen in the last 7,000 years. But nothing changed at the heart of the powerful Maya society. Changing even the smallest cog would have endangered the entire mechanism. It was impossible to implement profound changes. As a consequence of rarer resources, wars proliferated. Once again, the kings turned to the gods, going so far as to sacrifice captive souls to soften their wrath. But to no avail. Rebellion brewed fiercely in city-states. Barely 100 years after its pinnacle, the classical Maya era fell. Their temples were our present-day skyscrapers. Where they invoked the gods to soften the climate, we invoke technology to tackle the climate deadlock. Their complexity has become ours. So how to reconcile 200 countries that make up today's world, where 70 cities have failed? That is the challenge that we try to take on today. Since 1992, world leaders have been coming together every year to find solutions to the environmental crisis. These meetings are called COPs, or the Conferences of the Parties.
The early 90s correspond to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the confrontation between the two blocs, and therefore to the hope of seeing the advent of a world where world problems can be solved through world cooperation.
Very rapidly, these major international bashes became a window display for good intentions. But on the other side of the window, discussions were at a standstill. Over 40 years after the first Earth Summit, our global CO2 emissions continue to beat records. There have been attempts made to find global solutions, such as the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which sought to limit greenhouse gas emissions. But the wave of hope felt in the 90s seems to have vanished, leaving in its wake a complex, tense dialogue, which is sometimes even impossible. In the end, inaction prevails. Worse yet, some countries are backtracking. In 2012, Canada left the Kyoto Protocol. Without the threat of disciplinary action, it is now free to exploit its colossal oil sand deposits in Alberta, which equate to 168 billion barrels underground. It is the world's third largest oil reserve. It's an ecological disaster. This radical political and industrial choice clearly determines the country's priorities. Our good old economic growth comes before environmental concerns.
all change requires courage because people fear change. People experience change. Even if the change might be good for them in the long run, many people are afraid of change. For more than 20 years, there's been an organized campaign here in the United States to persuade the American people that climate change isn't really happening, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to change anything because there isn't even a problem. And that's a very attractive story for many people because we'd rather that everything was fine. We'd rather not change. We'd rather there not be a problem. The tragedy of this story, in my opinion, is twofold. One is that because of disinformation, we've lost a lot of time during which we could have and should have been working on solutions. So the problem is now substantially worse and will be substantially harder to fix. But also we've spread this pathology elsewhere.
It's a minefield. Interests seem too divergent. On the one hand, we need to adapt to major climate change, and on the other, at the origin of this change is the comfort of our modern societies that is so hard to abandon. The Vikings, prisoners of their way of life, were unable to adapt to the onset of the glacial era. The Mayas, trapped in their overly complex society, were unable to pacify conflicting interests when the climate changed. As for us, persisting with a model that is unsuited to our environment and trapped in a society that has become too complex, we have both scenarios combined. So, how do we avoid collapse?
What motivates a human being? What motivates man? Generally, it's when he faces danger, immediate danger, danger he can see, danger which cannot be argued with. Imagine a mammoth barreling down on a hunter-gatherer. He legs it. If someone were to tell him, hey buddy, in 20 years a mammoth is going to come after you, well, he won't care. Even if the mammoth is 10 kilometers away, he won't budge. We can't seem to grasp that the Earth's finiteness is not the only thing at stake, or that we cannot keep accumulating greenhouse gases forever. Finiteness is also in our heads. We have reflexes, ways of reacting. We can't get beyond this.
In order to change, do we need to wait and be constrained by those who lead us? In Japan, the path of Juras was chosen to bring the country out of a major ecological crisis. In 1657, a huge fire devastated Edo, the capital. 100,000 people perished. It would take 2 years to rebuild the city. Timber needs were immense, but wood had become scarce because at that time Japan faced the threat of deforestation. However, for several decades, the country had seen a period of peace and prosperity. In 1 century, the population had doubled. Forests were cleared to make way for arable land. In rapidly expanding cities, wood was used for everything. Progressively, forests which had until then been left intact became coveted. As few rules governed lumber exploitations, deforestation soon affected the entire country. The first effects soon started to manifest. Deforested land caves, weakened irrigation systems, agricultural yields dropped, famine erupted. People fought over what would become of the last wooded areas. The shogun, who held the central and military power, and the daimyo, local lords, decided to take action. Deforested land was fenced off. Authorizations became mandatory to chop wood or let livestock graze. Faced with danger, the villagers saw to it that these new rules were respected. Wood transportation was also controlled, as were the roads and waterways. Laws determined who was allowed to use wood sections and for which purpose. Those who did not respect the laws were punished. At the same time, in order to maintain or improve their standard of living, families were having fewer children. There were more abortions and infanticides. To support these restrictive rules, the government and village communities took measures to replenish the forests. Once again, however, their use was strictly controlled. In homes, cooking and heating tools were becoming more economical. Building techniques were also adapted. By imposing strict rules that were accepted by the population, Japan managed to get beyond the deforestation crisis and to avoid its collapse. Are constraints imposed by an authoritarian power our only horizon?
A lot has been said about eco-fascism. I'm not saying it's impossible, because in history, as we know, authoritarian regimes have often best dealt with immediate dangers. But why would dictators be more virtuous than people? Dictators reason just like everyone else. They won't choose hardship until our backs are to the wall. Consequently, since we only adopt authoritarian measures if we are up against the wall, we can imagine that citizens will change. I'm not sure that when we really reach that point of no return, we will step away from democracy. But we will all be convinced that a change is necessary, because danger will be right in front of us. And then, on the contrary, maybe a democratic regime will be the strongest, the most energetic, based on the common conviction that we can make changes together, in all fairness.
Climate change is here, and we know its major causes. Today, far removed from extreme solutions or shying away from the problem, other responses are emerging. Many are those who are facing up to this complex challenge. This environmental crisis is forcing us all to look at the nature that surrounds us. But on a deeper level, it invites us above all to look at ourselves and to question the way in which we all live together.
I think the focus exclusively on the environment doesn't get at the reality that the environment is simply shaped by society. So if we want to see a better environment, we have to think about the structure of our societies. Can we, as globalized societies, think about ourselves as permanent? Can we think about the fact that whatever we do ultimately is going to determine the future of nature and our societies? Can we live like this?
States, multinationals, citizens. The environmental question is being asked at all levels of society. Today, changes are already in motion, but it is not straightforward to implement them in such a complex system. China is a symbol of this paradox. 230 years after the invention of the steam engine in England, this vast country now has the largest concentration of industrial activity in the world.
China has grown exponentially for nearly 20 years. For the first decade of the new millennium, it achieved a double-digit growth, which is unprecedented in history. In 2006-2007, it overtook the USA as the world's largest emitter.
China has the finger pointed at it as the world's biggest polluter. It's the perfect culprit, except that when it comes to calculations, everything is a matter of point of view. What if the leading world power were in fact polluting for the entire planet?
In a certain way, the situation in China mirrors the situation in 19th century Manchester, when it was the world's textile workshop. China has become the world's industry. The energy efficiency efforts that are trumpeted in Europe are, in fact, closely related to relocating the most energy-intensive and polluting industries to China.
If someone manufactures a product in China, which is then exported to France or Germany or the United Kingdom, whose emissions are those really? So we blame China. We say that those are Chinese emissions, but the goods and services are actually being consumed by Westerners. And if you calculate what it looks like if you credit those emissions not to the person who built the car or the airplane or whatever it is, but to the person who uses it, then Chinese emissions fall very, very low.
In China, massive growth has taken place without regard for the environment or the health of the population, as was the case in Europe centuries before. And so, faced with this danger, Beijing is attempting to go green. China has become the country that invests the most in the renewable energy sector. But these investments also feed another global commercial battle, one for the control of these new markets. And Beijing firmly expects to maintain its position as leader. It will guzzle its way through millions of tons of coal in order to be the #1 solar panel manufacturer in the world. Between the fight against pollution and cutthroat economic competition, is it possible to implement a radical energy transition?
History has never undergone an energy transition. The history of energy amounts to a succession of various sources of energy. We didn't transition from wood to coal and then from coal to oil. We went from a system based on wood to a system based on coal and wood, then to a system based on coal, wood and oil. The notion of an energy transition gives the impression that there is a natural evolution, when in fact it is totally radical in history. Genuine energy transition has never occurred before.
The great world powers, whether they are political or industrial, are like a huge ocean liner that's too cumbersome to maneuver. Going green may take a while. To respond against this inertia, citizens have decided to take action, to accelerate things, and together invent a new model for society.
All around the world, we are seeing, in response to the climate crisis, a quiet revolution happening of ordinary people realizing that the scale of what needs to be done is too big, is too important just to be left to governments, just to be left to business. There's an incredible flowering, a flourishing of creativity, of entrepreneurship, of community coming together as one of the key elements of the global response to climate change, and is something that is really thrilling to see and to be part of.
To change the system, why not put pressure on the mechanisms that it is made up of? Like finance, for example. With climate change, the environmental issue whets many appetites. The rarer something is, the higher the price it has. So financiers are already speculating on the disappearance of some species or the preservation of certain plants. But other citizens want to do things differently. They want to render these mechanisms profitable in order to preserve nature, to cease viewing it as just a reserve that we can dip into as we please. Harry Assenmacher has been driven by this philosophy for more than 20 years. In 1995, when he was at the head of a major environmental NGO, he created Forest Finance. His company sells savings products based on forest resources.
My experience from these past 40 years has shown me that charity doesn't enable you to save the forests nor the world. New economic systems need to be introduced. It's not just a new way of conducting finance, but a whole range of industrial practices that take the wealth of nature into account. For millennia, forests have provided countless services to humanity, without us ever giving anything in return. We just thought, the forest is right there, so if I need to take something, I can just go and get it. But now that forests are shrinking, the question of paying for its services has become central.
Forest finance clients invest in wooded plots in Panama, Colombia, Peru or Vietnam. Simultaneously, their capital is also used to reforest lands which have been stripped by intensive farming. Over time, part of this timber will be sold, thereby ensuring that the investor receives added value. But here, profitability is not instant. It's the prerequisite for associating profit and preserving nature.
In our current model of society, based on quick profit, it's quite awkward to explain that benefits will only start yielding in 20 to 25 years, over the span of a generation, and that this is perfectly normal. It's awkward, but we won't give in. We hope that people will finally understand that we're not about making a 10% profit in barely 3 months. We want to generate values which will serve future generations.
Werte zu schaffen.
A portion of this wood will never be cut down, and therein lies Forest Finance's green commitment. Little by little, forests are re-emerging, ready to welcome animal and plant life. Harry Assenmacher has therefore chosen to take on the climate challenge by using finance. In this way, he hopes to change our relationship with nature and the resources that it offers to us, such as wood. Fossil energies also make up a part of these resources that we exploit as we please. Other citizens elsewhere in the world strive to change the energy model that they supply. Began, a small town in southern Brittany. Here, people have carried off the extraordinary feat of producing their own energy.
I wanted to set up a private wind turbine at my place, and so did a colleague. We realized it would be complicated, so we thought we might as well create a community project which would benefit an entire region.
And it worked. The idea caused a stir. Over 1 million people joined the movement, contributing money according to their income, soon joined by new investors. The operation proved to be profitable because the electricity it produces is bought by EDF at a state-guaranteed price. More than 10 years later, 12 million euros have been collected, enough to finance 4 wind turbines.
The participatory aspect is important and powerful because everyone, be they leaders or not, regardless of their level of responsibility, is a volunteer. And everyone contributes in their own way, becoming more involved and communicating with citizens, following up on acoustics, on fauna and flora. Once the project has been launched, the adventure continues. People keep on supporting it.
The collaborative wind turbines have made a dent in the model of great energy groups. Here, electricity is produced in the interest of the community and the environment. Through their local action, the people of Began are responding in their own way to the global issue of climate change. What if small cogs triggered larger ones? Beyond communities like Began, what is happening in the big cities? In fact, are megalopolises the symbols of the Anthropocene? This age of man could play a major role in confronting climate change.
Cities are part of the Anthropocene in that they represent the mastery of nature, man overcoming nature, man even annihilating nature, and of course they contribute 80% of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. So you might say they are responsible for the great proportion of greenhouse gases and of global warming. The great thing about cities is their scale. They allow, they enable, they facilitate participation, cooperation in participatory budgeting, which is happening in Paris and New York and Latin America. We are finding that citizens engage in actually spending money. They, through initiatives, can be engaged. So at the local level, the municipal level, they can work together, they can get together with politicians and find common solutions.
Cities could be the birthplaces of rapid and direct responses to the issues raised by climate change. That's what is happening in Barcelona. In this city in crisis, polluted and polluting, an independent movement has been set in motion. All across the Catalonian capital, new citizen initiatives are emerging. Their birthplace? Fab Labs. Fab Labs are a new breed of collaborative laboratories. They are places that make tools for design and construction available to all. In one of these Fab Labs, the prototype of a solar house was conceived. To build this house, you can simply download the plans for free from the internet. This is open source. With the blueprints in hand, one need only head for another Fab Lab to use their equipment. This is how Fab Labs are pulverizing the closed culture of competition to found an economy based on trading and sharing.
By using the fabrication tools that you can have in a Fab Lab, you can design something in Peru and then upload that design and could be downloaded in New Zealand in a matter of seconds and can be reproduced in a matter of couple hours. No? Imagine how that can reduce the cost of shipping materials from one side to the other of the world. And instead of doing that, cities can just exchange data of how things are made, and then they can keep the production inside the city. So we can really have the power to produce locally, but exchange and participate in a global village and a global network. For me, that's one of the highest potentials of digital fabrication, is actually reducing the impact of the human footprint in the planet.
Cities have two possibilities in the future. A city created from a positive, self-sufficient point of view, which produces its own resources and is capable of taking charge of its future. An accessible city built around its neighborhoods. Or something out of Blade Runner, megalopolises with rich centers and dirt-poor suburbs where people live in squalor, as a handful of well-off people live in giant towers, cut off and isolated from the rest of the world. We will have to choose between these two models. This image for the future will probably resemble an image of the past. Roads would have fewer cars, more people would walk, augmented with public transportation, much like Barcelona, where we will have electric buses. Sidewalks will be widened, more trees would grow, consequently bringing nature back into our cities.
Cities are home to 54% of the world's population and play a major role in climate change. Like Barcelona, other megalopolises are taking action and looking to provide practical solutions. They are forming networks together, like the C40, the union of 75 of the world's biggest cities, which Barcelona is a part of. From all of these good intentions, a much broader dynamic could come into being. That's if it is accepted by the whole of society, even going so far as appearing in the texts that are the foundations for our modern democracies. And that is something that is already happening. In 2008, the new president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, called upon his fellow citizens to write a new constitution. The people of Ecuador mainly rallied behind the idea. Amongst the proposals, environmental activists put forward an idea which seemed inconceivable: to give nature rights. The environment treated as an equal to humankind? This revolutionary idea was accepted and written into the country's constitution. However, with time, the reality would prove to be much more complex. Ecuador is a melting pot of exceptional biodiversity. But the country also relies heavily on oil. A paradox that would become apparent when huge reserves were discovered in the heart of the Yasuni National Park to the east. What was the right thing to do? To preserve nature or growth?
In 2007, the country intended to keep the oil where it was. It asked the international community for financial compensation, equating to 50% of what it would have earned had it exploited these reserves. In 2013, 6 years after the initiative was presented, which the entire world had welcomed as a revolutionary idea of preserving oil reserves in a region of exceptionally rich biodiversity, Ecuador went backward, owing to a lack of means for preserving the national park.
Ecuador only received a derisory amount. The oil companies have been allowed to drill, much to the disappointment of environmental activists. But despite the failure of the Yasuni initiative, the inscription of the rights of nature in the Ecuadorian constitution is a major turning point. Since then, this idea has spread and been taken up by other citizens in other countries.
We continue to believe that giving nature rights represents tremendous progress, not only for Ecuador but for all of humanity. Recognizing that nature has a right is a step the whole world should take. The entire model must be changed in order to progress towards a bio-centered model, a model in which we understand that nature's rights are not detached from humanity's, because we are nature. By recognizing that nature has rights, we also recognize that we have rights. We must change our relationship with nature, change the model that constantly exploits nature, which is what we are currently experiencing in the capitalist model.
Will we be able to turn the very model which made us so powerful upside down? Will we summon that level of humility?
Every civilization has asked, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to fulfill our humanity?
Today, the world is buzzing with a multitude of initiatives that reveal the extraordinary creativity and solidarity that we are capable of when faced with challenges.
One of the Anthropocene's major stakes is the diversity of opinions, people and solutions which can be considered to solve our environmental problems.
We have to try a lot of things. We have to talk to our friends and neighbors and fellow citizens. And maybe if we could begin to think more about listening and finding ways to understand our fellow citizens more profoundly, then we could begin to think about solutions that we maybe not all agree about, but at least a mix of solutions or a set of solutions that all of us could at least buy into some portion of it.
The climate challenge is complex and there will be no miracle solution. We need these varied responses in order to sustain a profound change, and these solutions will form proof of a substantial shared desire for change.
I think that the Anthropocene gives us an opportunity to reflect on the scope of what our enterprise is, to move beyond the idea that what happens to us is coming from outside somehow, coming from nature, and to think in terms of the responsibilities that we have now for nature and for society, that ultimately there's no one that can save us except ourselves.
It is possible for us to be the artisans of a new era, and maybe that will give rise to a new way of living on this earth, which we have permanently altered.